from Brown University, still in the faculty there in computer science. He's currently on leave, spending his time split between Google and also Stanford. So today he's going to be telling us about work that he's been doing on works kind of close to what we're doing, trying to model the processes going on in the cortex. And before getting into this field, he has a long history of being involved in work on belief networks and stochastic decision processes. And so, anyways, it's kind of parts that we're interested in hearing.
Great. Thanks, Bruno. And I'm glad to be here. By the way, my title was not really meant to be provocative. It was, in some sense, a dry run for a talk that I'm going to give at Google in another week. And I should give a disclaimer that in addition to working now, I work for Numenta. This is Jeff Hawkins' startup company for 4 months back at the beginning of the year. And I certainly don't want that title to be construed as that Google is mounting a competition for Numenta. Numenta is definitely in the business of building cortexes. This title was by way of the analogy, why should General Motors be in the extruded plastics business? Answer, because they make more plastic parts than any other manufacturer, OEM, in the United States. So that's the spirit of the title. As Bruno pointed out, my background is in belief networks, graphical models of a directed sort. And this talk will use the semantics of such graphical models to a large extent. Go away. So I'm going to start with the title of the talk that Jeff Hinton gave at ICHCAI in 2005. What kind of graphical model is the brain? And as you can imagine, Jeff would have his own answer to that, and probably has something to do with Boltzmann machines and Helmholtz machines and other architectures that he has been instrumental in. I have a somewhat different take on that. And in particular, my answer to that question is that the brain is, in some respects, a hierarchical Bayesian model, not surprising given my background. And it's a generative model, a stochastic one. It uses time. It's very much sequence-based, and in that respect, I am akin to the work that Jeff Hawkins is doing. And as a departure from sort of the classical Bayesian networks, which are in some sense a mathematical artifact, it's a data structure and a continuously evolving type of object. So why should Google care? To a large extent, Google is very interested in being able to do things that are similar to what the cortex is able to do. In particular, they have a large number of engineers and PhDs in particular that are working on problems such as classifying pornography. Google will allow you to go to pornographic sites, but when you're not expecting it, it tries to avoid that for good reasons. So classifying content's critical. They also, Gmail is a very popular mechanism whereby Google can borrow your eyeballs for ads. And so they want to make sure it's the best around, and their spam filtering team is one of the best in the world. They mainly support vector machines and similar kinds of models for this, so they're using discriminative models. Whereas I think that they should be thinking more seriously about using generative models. Generative models have been used to describe the construction of the World Wide Web as a whole, and they make a very good mechanism for reasoning about content. And what is Google and its millions of machines, if not a giant content addressable memory? It's also coincidence-based, so it's trying to find interactions between things that would be otherwise obscure. since they currently use a bag of words model, it isn't currently sequence-based, though they've been hiring up people right and left that know a lot about language to make it more sequence-based. And of course, more and more, it's fundamentally multi-modal, especially with their recent acquisitions in video. So I don't tend to preach to the choir here, but I'll use a couple of terms, and just to make sure we're all on the same page. I use the term cortical column, and I don't have to tell you the story about the way the cortex is arrayed, and you may be of one or the other many schools about cortical columns. Some people believe they don't exist or they're not interesting, but the idea of a cortical column as a computational entity that's replicated on a grand scale within the cortex is very similar to the model that we use. And so, in succession, the one on the far right is about what you would expect if you looked at our model in some detail. And it's based on the notion of a hypercolumn, which is about 100,000 cells. And the basic units that we'll be talking about in just a moment correspond roughly to a hypercolumn. Receptive fields, all of our basic components will have an associated receptive field in much the same use of the term as Ubel and Wiesel. And we will be looking at one portion of the cortex, the what portion of the cortex, namely the ventral medial pathways, and trying to implement a model that captures some of the same capabilities of that model, of that pathway. Simple and complex cells. Does everybody in this audience know the difference between simple and complex cells? Does anyone not know the difference between them? Okay. So you should get a better vantage on the slides there. A simple complex cell, simply put, is one that responds rather specifically to a stimuli such as an oriented bar, which is situated in one point, in one position within their receptive field. Whereas a complex cell, again, simply put, is one that will respond to a class of stimuli, such as a bar, but at a certain orientation, but situated anywhere within the receptive field. So that's the fundamental difference. One can, in some cases, be modeled as a simple linear function. Others are much more complicated to model. So what are the functional characteristics that we're most interested in? Most all of them have to do with pattern recognition in one form or another, and exploiting the fact that we can do a form of search without doing search at all by using invariance. And invariance will play a big role in the presentation in the next couple of steps. So if you think of the first four areas of the ventral medial pathway as a set of modules, and the interaction between them involving feed forward and feed backwards, you get a stack such as the one shown here, and that is the object of our study. So there are four elements that I'll focus on and that we have tried to exploit in engineering the system that we're building at Google. The first is the notion of representing the cortex as a hierarchy of features of increasing abstraction. You can think of them as each level being a conjunction of features at the level below. And while Fukushima perhaps was not the first to do this, he's one of the earliest, and his neocognitron is probably the best exposition of this idea back in the 80s. The next is the notion that sensory input it's a blooming, buzzing world out there. Our sensory input changes very quickly, whereas the features that we're trying to learn, the features that we try to characterize the world are persistent and stable, and they change much more slowly. And probably the first, or the proponent that most scholars think is most responsible for this, is a fellow named Peter Foldiak in a dissertation he did at Harvard. which for a long time went unnoticed largely in the United States, though in Europe it was a big thing, and there were several companies that were set up in order to implement versions of Peter's work. Unfortunately, they were on the wrong position in Intel's curve, and most of those projects fell flat. The third one is a very simple idea due to, well, I don't know who it's due to, but I think that Shimon Ullman in a 1999 paper gave the best exposition of this. And this is a great paper. It's a very short, concise paper with a very clean combinatorial argument about how to avoid the over-zealousness of invariant models so that they don't respond inappropriately to things. It adds selectivity to the match. And finally, to put all this together, to allow the different levels of this abstraction to interact in a reasonable way and to get a coherent mathematical model, we represent the entire structure as a particular type of graphical model which has well-founded semantics. So the first idea, we're turning everything around now because we're going to start with the general architecture and then drill back down into the details, is started with some work by David Mumford back in the early 90s, and probably had its clearest exposition in a paper that he did with Tai-Sing Lee in 2003, in which again he describes the first four areas of the visual cortex as a graphical model, a simple chain, as it were, where he has, being a mathematician, conveniently described an entire area of the cortex as a single random variable. But the most important thing is, in some sense, the way that he's conditioned these variables, the way that he's described the overall joint distribution as a product of conditional distributions, which is the classic way that Pearl did in his work on belief networks. It has a very nice characteristic in terms of a generative model. It's very simple to work with. From a complexity point of view of how to actually do the computations, it is problematic to some extent, but David and Tai-Sing invoked an algorithm called particle filtering as a way of characterizing the computations performed by their model. They did not, however, provide any mechanism for doing learning. How would you learn these models in the first place? And that's basically where I came in. Talking to David over a year and a half ago, as I stepped down as deputy provost at Brown and was looking about for something to do, and being expert in the area of graphical models and Markov decision processes in particular, and being sick to death of working in that area, I said, hey, this sounds really neat. I'd like to play with it. So I'll try to build you a learning algorithm. So I'm going to start with a cartoon. In fact, this is the first time I've given this talk. And I tried to make it equation-free. Everything is drawn in terms of graphics. The graphics have well-understood semantics. There'll be two types of semantics, and I'll warn you when I switch between the two types of semantics. But hopefully the graphics will help. And I'm sorry for those of you who are way on the side because it's a little hard to see that. I could actually turn this around, but then I couldn't turn the thing. So this is a very simple hierarchical graphical model, 3 levels, and it's simple so that I can expand it into a lot more detail. There are arcs between levels, go from one level to the level below it. Currently there are no arcs between nodes on a given level, but there will be later on. Those are part of what we learn. These models are very large. The assumption is that in any given layer there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of variables. And so we do the standard technique in graphical models. We factor it into smaller components and then propagate information between those components. So in these cartoons, the the components will be these red triangles. They will always look like of this form. And if you look at this structure as a whole, you'll see that of the same form, a node and its parent and its children in the layer before are always exactly of this form. So there will be 1, 2, 3, 4 subnets in this. And then the first thing we do is we explode the graph into those overlapping sets of what we'll call subnets. And we now have a distributed representation of the model that I showed you on the previous slide, where the products that are issued from each of these move in either direction. Even though the arrows only go in one direction, the arrows indicate conditional independence or conditional dependence. And as we all know, Bayes' rule allows us to turn that arrow right around, so information flows back and forth across those arrows. So the products that move between these components, you can think of them as instantiations of variables. That's the model that you have in the particle filtering framework. Or you can think of them as what are called potentials, which are marginal distributions that characterize the marginals for subsets of these variables. This, as I said, this is a new talk, so I'm not really sure I want to go into this in a great deal. One of the characteristics of the model that we're building, though have not yet implemented, that is, it's implemented, but we haven't actually tried these on real data because the work that we're doing at Google is just getting to the point where we'll be able to perform large-scale experiments. But the subnets in a given level, at the lowest level, have relatively small span, and this is determined by a stochastic model overall. And as you go to higher and higher levels, the in and the out degree of the nodes in the network stay the same. It's more or less constant with some uncertainty. But the span, as it were, that is, if you think of the 3D embedding of the obvious 3D embedding of this graph, the reach of nodes gets longer and longer. And that has a nice property that as you get higher and higher, what's called the diameter of a graph when you limit it to a given level, gets smaller and smaller. And that, by the way, is in keeping with our understanding of the results of Breitenberg and Hughes. Okay, so what model do we have so far? We have a large graphical model, which is factored into a set of subnets. The subnets are arranged in layers, and as you go up higher and higher, their span gets larger and larger. So that's what this little graphic is supposed to indicate, with the pyramids indicating the various subnets. This is basically where I was when I gave a talk here almost 9 months ago in Soda Hall. And at that time, I waved my hands about how we were going to handle time. Actually, I didn't wave my hands very much because my talk went long, and so I didn't get to much of that. So today I'll be able to do that, I hope. So this graphic, which is supposed to represent the spatial and temporal context of our decision, of our inference process. So each row basically corresponds to all of the spatial variables. So there will be 2 dimensions of space, but in order to project this onto a flat screen, all the spatial variables at a given time point are at a given level. And now we see time receding into the vanishing point. You can imagine that these variables correspond to the periphery of the nervous system, and we're seeing these wash through our visual and proprioceptive, etc. Centers. Now, the whole idea of building these hierarchical models is you abstract from the details, the low-level details of these spatial variables and now temporal variables. And so this graphic is supposed to indicate that a given node in a higher level, the next level in abstraction, has a particular spatiotemporal receptive field. And And so I've focused in on the details of one unit. Again, the receptive field, the spatiotemporal receptive field of a single node here. And the operation of a subnet can be characterized in terms of three different stages. In the first stage, there's a spatial aggregation, where essentially we take the spatiotemporal receptive field and we map that onto a set of categories or classes. You can think of them as the spatial patterns, the prototypes of the overall model. There's a variety of ways we could do that. If the inputs were continuous, we might use something like a mixture of Gaussians. For all of the variables in our network above the first level, they are all nominal valued. And so we'd have to deal with the discrete aspect of it. And we use a particular model called a tree-augmented naive Bayes network, which you can think of as a discrete analog of the mixture of Gaussians. So that's the first stage, spatial aggregation or spatial pooling. The second stage is we take the patterns, the input, the spatiotemporal receptive field filtered through that model, think of it as the observation model, and we get a set of multinomials over our class variable. Now what we do is we analyze that from the standpoint of a time series, and we fit it to a particular kind of Markov model, a stochastic model. So that's the second stage. Actually, all we're doing at this point is capturing the dynamics of this compressed characterization of the spatiotemporal receptive field. And the last stage is one in which we further compress that. We essentially take the dynamics as an object, and you can think of that as the transition matrix for the the temporal model that we just constructed. We take that matrix and we perform a form of spectral analysis on it to compress that still further, and the details of that compression and that analysis will be critical, and I'll get to that in just a minute. So what's the obvious way to capture this? Well, that's the notion of a hidden Markov model. In general, a hidden Markov model can be characterized by a four-tuple. We won't go into the details, but you can think of it as a set of hidden states, a set of observations, a transition matrix that captures how the states evolve over time, and an emission probability distribution, which captures the observations. So relative to our previous slide, the observation model or the emissions probabilities will characterize our first compression of the spatiotemporal receptive field. The second stage will correspond to learning the transition matrix for the corresponding process. And the third stage, I'm coyly going to leave that off for yet a couple of other slides. So this is our embedded little Markov, our little model. Right now, in the first instantiation of this, as I gave you about 5 slides back, it's just a small little Bayes net. What we're going to do is we're going to expand that into a model that captures the temporal component. And to do that, we're going to use something called a dynamic Bayesian network, which one of my students, Keiji Kanazawa, who 10 years ago actually was a postdoc here working with Stuart Russell, Keiji and I developed back in the late 80s. And so the easy way to think about this is we take this little model and we're going to replicate it some number of times. And so here we've replicated it 4 times. It's exactly the same topology as this network, replicated on 4 occasions. And then we're going to take the output variable, as it were, and we're going to link them up so that now we have a Markov chain. That's the fundamental model for a simple hidden Markov model represented as a dynamic Bayesian network. OK. Now, as I characterized it, the first thing we do is we take these receptive fields and we compress it into a class variable. Then the next thing we do is we learn the transition matrix of the underlying Markov chain, and then we compress that time as well. Well, there's some consequences of doing that. When you compress time in a, and this is another sort of the grand dynamic Bayesian network, where this corresponds to all the possible variables and their transition matrix. In the grand model, everything is local. Local in space, local in time. But when you compress time, what you end up doing is you induce additional long-term spatial dependencies. Similarly, when you compress space, you induce longer temporal dependencies. So you have second order and third order and high order Markov processes. That complicates things to no end. So back, yes.
You introduce these higher order dependencies among the compressed variables, or
yes, among the compressed variables. Yeah. Back to the picture that we had before. So this was our first expansion, taking the simple model and breaking it out into this multi-layer or multi-slice model. And now what we're going to do is we're going to transform this through a couple of stages until we get to the final model. And so this is mainly an expository technique. So the first thing we're going to do, again, remember the three stages in the presentation I gave a few seconds ago, is we're going to learn the emission probabilities. And this model, and now I have basically slipped in a new variable, and it will be a new latent variable that we're going to interpose between the inputs to one of these subnets and the output. And the output will appear again in just a second. So this is our way of taking the input data and transforming it into a class variable. And the way you learn this is using an unsupervised technique. You use expectation maximization. And this, as I said, could be a mixture of Gaussians or a naive Bayes network or whatever you like. The next stage is we connect up all of these slices. So we have a hidden Markov model where the class variable now is, you can think of the class variable as being an alphabet, the alphabet of spatial patterns that we've learned. Now, as I said, since we're compressing space and time, we have to at least account for the possibility of having higher order dependencies. And so I've drawn this as a bounded order Markov process where the bound on the order is 3. So it can be as bad as a 3 Markov process. We can learn this as well. But a simple way to do it would be to take all of the data that's streaming through the system, filter it through this emission model, and take the resulting set of alphabetic characters or distributions over those alphabet characters and learn the Markov chain. Again, it's a very simple operation to perform. So now we have a variable order Markov model. By the way, in learning this, this is usually something that scares people from a combinatoric point of view because the size of the probability table that would describe this variable would be exponential in the bound on the order. We learn it using what are called tree-based methods, probabilistic suffix trees, which capture a very compact representation of this, which just gets selected bigrams, trigrams, and in general n-grams that are common within the data stream. So that's very efficient. And so, for example, you can stream 10,000 elements through this in a matter of seconds. And learning the tree characterization of this bounded depth Markov process takes another few seconds. So it's very fast. All right. Now, all you saw, if you blinked, is that some arcs disappeared. And what we did essentially is we substituted the previous variable, which is like described it as an alphabet of spatial patterns, sigma, for a new variable, omega. And omega basically is the set of all those bigrams and trigrams that we learned just in the previous stage. So the way the learning algorithm works is it builds a tree dynamically online and the leaves of that tree basically correspond to, you might think of them as small little chains, or what I call composite states that are formed from our initial alphabet. So now the nice thing is we've taken the model that before was K Markov, or bounded by K, and we now have a Markov process again. And typically, if the alphabet is on the order of 100, then the set of leaves of this compressed tree are on the order of a few hundred, max of about 1,000. Now we're going to add back the variable that we just lost. We lost a few minutes ago, namely our output variable. And here, what this variable is supposed to do is supposed to compactly classify or characterize the transition probabilities that are described by the Markov chain. And we're going to take a brief departure and come back to this to introduce something called slow features. Now this is terminology that was introduced by Wiscott and Sosnowski. Yes?
I think it was confused on the last slide. Where did the lateral connections between the lines come from?
They came from the previous. We were learning the how these alphabetic characters, as it were, these prototypes, evolve over time. All right, and we allowed that they may have be dependent upon some history of previous ones, up to K, where K is 3 in this case. So we added those arcs in the graph in order to represent that. And then we lost the other arcs because, having learned a set of you can think of them as sequences of these alphabetic characters, we then turned those to be our states and ended up with a single arc.
But doesn't that change the relationship now between this new variables omega? The new variables up there?
This changes the representation of this?
Yeah, those relationships now change?
No, because in some sense, if you think of them as sequences, yeah. At any given time, the emission is only dependent upon the last alphabetic character in that sequence. So that stays exactly the same. So this arc is supposed to characterize what we're just getting to, the notion of a slow feature. And I'm going to explain my understanding of invariance, and it's a little bit different than what you would see in the rest of the literature. I think that Peter Foldiak said it best in describing this notion of invariance, and what it is that we're trying to learn is that, as I added in the initial part of the talk, the world changes very quickly. The inputs are random and stochastic. And at any given time, if you look at the input at time t and the input at time a small time later, there's a lot of noise in that. So somehow you have to abstract away from that. You have to compress it, and you have to capture the stable patterns, the persistent patterns within that data stream. We learned in the previous slide, we showed how we would learn a model of how these compressed spatial variables, spatiotemporal variables, evolve over time. You can think of that as being a stochastic automaton of sorts. So this is the first shift in the semantics of the graphs we're drawing. This graph is a state transition diagram. All of the graphs that we've looked at in previous things, the nodes corresponded to random variables. In this case, the nodes correspond to states. So those of you who are in computer science know a state transition diagram. This describes a Markov chain or a finite automata, all of those kinds of processes. So the semantics are, you're in state 1, and with some probability, 0.7, you'll end up in state 2. With some probability, 0.3, you'll cycle back to state 1. And whenever you enter 1, you'll emit an output symbol, in this case A. So if you ran this process, what would happen is, let's suppose it started in state 1, that notice that it's relatively unlikely that you're going to get to the bottom part of the graph. So you're going to bounce back and forth between 1 and 2 for some long time. And then finally, you're going to be in 2, and you're going to bounce out, and you're going to end up in 4. So you'd see a sequence of A, B, A, B, A, B, 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 A, A, B, B, A, A, something of that sort. Finally, you get over here, and now you're going to bounce back and forth between 3 and 4 for a while. And now you're going to see A, C, C, A, C, C, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So you can think of this as being two automata that are weakly coupled through these arcs. And so the task of learning the invariance of this process, the slow features, is essentially to learn that there are two basic modes for this thing overall. And either it's in one or the other, and then to recognize when it's in which one. So that is how I think of slow feature analysis, and it's based upon the dynamics of the underlying world, which, as Foldiak pointed out, generally correspond to various kinds of transformations that the features that we see in the world are undergoing. They move right and left because we move right and left, or they move right and left. They rotate, they loom, or get smaller as we approach or move away from them. So back to the model that we had before. This is the same model on the previous slide of the multi-slice model, with one exception. We've added these three arcs. Everything else is the same. This arc, and the way that you learn these models is this is a representation of time over a short sequence, 4 sort of ticks of the clock, as it were. And the way that you learn them is you start with some sort of a prior on all of these random variables, or all of the conditional probability distributions that describe or quantify the overall model. And then you use an algorithm like EM in order to adjust those parameters until you maximize the likelihood. The normal way that you characterize the prior is usually by using something called a Dirichlet distribution and what are called pseudo counts. So essentially what you're doing is saying, I'm going to estimate, say, a fair coin, and I watch it coming up heads and tails, but I assume I have some prior knowledge about whether or not it's going to be a fair coin or not. And the way I represent my belief that it's likely to be a fair coin is I pretend as though I've already seen so many head flips, so many coin flips. And as a consequence, that adds some inertia, as it were, to my changing those parameters. So I'm not going to move too quickly if I see 4 heads in a row to say that it's not a fair coin. I'll move a little bit in that direction, but not very quickly. Okay? So all of these have these things called Dirichlet priors. The Dirichlet priors for these arcs are a little bit different. These are transition matrices. These arcs quantify the transition probabilities over the set of states. You can think of it as a big matrix where the ith and jth point is the probability of going from state I to state j. Along the diagonal is the probability that you're in state I and you end up back in state I. The notion of slow features and the notion in our automata sort of characterization of slow features is that the tendency is that the kind of features we want to learn are ones in which the variable changes very slowly. It tends to stay the same. So what we're going to end up doing is trying to cluster states that are in these same subautomata. So what we do is we take our Dirichlet prior, as it's called, which corresponds to all these pseudopoints, indicating the strength of our conviction that we don't want it to change too fast. For those of you who know about machine learning, it's a form of smoothing function or a regularizer for our overall learning algorithm that helps us to avoid overfitting. And we take the diagonal and we fatten it along the diagonal. We just take the pseudo counts and make it more likely that we will that the process that we learn is going to have a pronounced increase in the values along the diagonal, and that's all we do. So before, yes.
I'm really confused. You're talking about slowness of what features you want to learn versus the slowness of learning.
No, I'm not talking about the slowness of learning.
Okay.
I'm just talking about, see, each one of these variables initially has no semantics.
Your prior is what you expect to be slow. So whatever you're learning, whatever the prior will be learned, it will be slow. I mean,
You're actually right. You're right. So in some sense, the reason that you use Dirichlet priors is you don't want them to move too quickly. So and that does have to do with learning. There's this other aspect that what we want to do is we want to bias it so that this variable is one that relative to the transition matrix that describes its evolution, it will tend to stay in the same states. So yes, there's two different types of slowness going on there. And as I said, this is prior to our running the learning algorithm on this, is there's no semantics for it. We don't know what it's going to be. So what we want to do is encourage it to learn a particular class of features, those kinds of features that change slowly. We're trying to encourage it to do that, and that's what these two forms of bias do for us. Okay? And so before I described it in terms of 3 steps that you could perform, 3 algorithms, you can also take this as being the complete semantics for this network. And you could apply your favorite Bayes-net learning algorithm to the whole thing with the appropriate Dirichlet priors, including the inertial priors that fatten up the diagonal in the case of the transition matrix on the output variable, and it tends to capture exactly the kinds of features that we would like it to. Okay, so in some sense, this talk up until now has been talking about what we did is we started with this network, a tiny network, which we were saying is a model for a much larger network, and we exploded it. And then we looked at one of those little networks, and we described the semantics of that network. And the last slide described in what really is a precise mathematical characterization what we expect of an individual subnet. But what happened to the network as a whole? What does it represent? And the answer will take a little departure. So we're back to the old semantics, or the new semantics, whichever way you want to think about it. Namely, this is another set of state transition diagrams. And in fact, it's a hierarchy of state transition diagrams. You can think of this as the highest level, most abstract set of states and the transition probabilities that would govern their evolution. And the semantics of this hierarchical hidden Markov model are when you're in a given state, you have 2 choices. Well, it depends upon what kind of state you are. There are terminal states, and terminal states would be something like this, which when you enter this state, you emit a symbol. Actually, in general, there's a distribution over those symbols, and you emit according to that distribution. Alternatively, you're a node like this, and you can almost think of this node as making a remote procedure call. So it calls another subautomata and turns control over to the subautomata, and it starts running for a while. And it runs for an indeterminate amount of time, but eventually it gets into a final state. And when it gets into the final state, it relinquishes control back to the calling program. So these are used to describe programs, obviously, languages, and in general, hierarchical abstractions. So this essentially is a 3-level hierarchical hidden Markov model. And it gives one example of what's called reuse, which makes it a compact characterization of certain kinds of hierarchical models. Reuse in the sense that this automata is shared by these 2 different automata. Okay. Does everybody understand the semantics of this? If you let it run, basically, you're going to end up with just what you end up in the automata that we showed in the previous slide, namely sequences of A's, B's, and C's. But it provides a very compact characterization of this complicated process by representing the state transitions at different levels of abstraction. So these are the separate automata. So now, yet again, we have a decomposition of a complicated automata into component pieces. But here the components are arranged in a set of abstractions. And we could decompose these further if we wanted to. So here is another dynamic Bayes network. It's a little bit complicated, but essentially it's equivalent to this. And the way this works is, for each of the levels, we have an abstraction or a state variable, x1, x2, x3. And to represent that the corresponding automaton gets into one of its final state, we add a special variable, f sub level number, that when the state arrives at final state, it uses as a trigger to tell the variable in the preceding stage that it's OK to make the next transition. Now, this is an abstraction, and it has a number of problems. One being is that it's very wasteful in terms of its space, as it were, if you were to replicate this exactly. Namely, that while this little automata at the low level is transitioning some indefinite number of times, we have to have a slice, basically, in order to represent each one of those transitions. But again, it's just an abstraction, and we need to have a simpler implementation of this. So what did I mean by that? So a little bit about the way that these interact. This is a large Bayes net. The way that we perform inference in it overall is essentially to do a form of belief propagation. We've tried particle filtering, following on the work of Lee and Mumford. But it also turns out that a much simpler expedient, which is called loopy belief propagation, works quite well for these models. But we're assuming, given the hierarchical hidden Markov model that I just mentioned, and the fact that we learn these slow features that change slowly, that in some sense, the temporal span of a node at this level is likely to be different than the temporal span of the node at the next higher level. And so here's a way of thinking about what's going on. The input to a given node is basically a set of samples, or more generally, a marginal distribution that sort of characterizes the joint probability of the variables that this subnet shares with its child subnets. These little red boxes are meant to represent a snapshot of the distribution of a given variable in the child subnet. And so this is just a binary variable, because that's easiest to represent. So every one of these slices corresponds to a distribution over this variable. Okay? And if you look at it, there you can see sort of a pattern of how it changes. And if you were to think of this as a continuous signal, you might try to estimate it by subsampling it. So the obvious thing to do is to use the Nyquist rate as a means of figuring out how often to sample it. And if you were to sample it at the Nyquist rate, you could capture all the interesting dynamics of how this process evolved. This process here, the subnet itself, learns this abstraction, and it learns these slow features of its inputs. And so if this is the output, and it's done its job correctly, again, we have a single, for simplicity, a single binary variable, and we watch how it changes at every tick of the clock. But the Nyquist rate, characterized in green here, is a lower frequency. And so the trick basically is to take this, this characterization in terms of continuous signals and to discretize it. And I admit that I don't have a great answer to how to do that. And so right now, it's all empirical, and we use a thresholding function. And that basically determines the semantics of the slices at the next highest level. So imagine that this is the subnet that we're trying to represent. Excuse me, the hierarchical hidden Markov model represented as a multi-sliced dynamic Bayes net that we're trying to represent. If it were the case that at every level in the hierarchy, the little subautomata have to go through at least 2 transitions before hitting a transition, before hitting a final state, then the number of slices that you would need in order to represent at the highest level, the kth level as it were, at least 1 transition of that highest abstraction variable would be exponential in k. So what we do basically is we don't have to represent all those. We use this hack, as it were, which we hope to make principal at some later date, of determining the Nyquist rate of the output of every level, and then using that as the determiner for when to sample from the subnet below it. And so using the sort of characterization that we had where you had 4 slices for the subnet, at the lowest level, there's the 4 slices for the lowest level subnets. Here is the 4 slices for the next level subnet, and there are 2 slices of the subnet in the 3rd level. So the total space, the total size of the model to form this approximation of the exponentially sized multi-slice network is constant in the number of levels. Obviously, it's an approximation, but it works out quite well in certain cases. So I have only a few minutes left, and I'd like to leave a little time for questions. So the key design elements, and these are both 4 what I think are very neat computational ideas about computational neuroscience, and also 4 very good papers. These would be papers on my top 10 list of papers. We represent things in terms of a hierarchy of features, of abstraction. Nowadays, this is so common that everybody takes it for granted, but when it first came out, there was a bit of subtlety about getting it right. We assume, and this is a fundamental assumption about the world, and therefore in our model it has to be translated into a constraint or a bias in the way that learning. Usually bias is a bad idea in learning. Here we want the bias to represent our background knowledge. But we assume that the world changes quickly, but the features that we want to learn, or maybe the only features that we can learn, are the ones that move slowly, that change slowly. And from a learning point of view, this is a key idea, because basically it's saying that we're trying to learn about the world in an unsupervised fashion. Generally, that is a waste of time. It's very hard to do that. Completely unsupervised learning algorithms do not work very well. But this little key that Foldiak expressed is one which opens the door in an interesting way. It says, I can't provide you with labels or the answers in a supervised fashion, but I can tell you that generally speaking, if you look at a set of inputs that are close together in time, they probably have the same label. And if they're far apart, all bets are off. I don't know. But when they're close together, they probably have the same label. That's a pretty important idea. And it makes it possible to learn things that you couldn't otherwise. If the world's not like that, you're screwed. Overlapping receptive fields. Again, it's a really simple idea, but if you want to read a really pretty paper, Ullman's good, and this is Ullman at his best. And then of all of these, well, Peters is definitely a neuroscientist perspective on things, but the Lee and Mumford paper is also a neuroscientist perspective. And actually, he gives very short shrift to the Bayesian models in his presentation, and spends a fair bit of time about trying to convince you that something as abstract as particle filtering might have something to do with population code. So it's a really nice paper. And with that, let's see. Hello. Implementation. So we've implemented all these things in MATLAB multiple times. We started hacking using something called the message passing interface protocol to build these distributed versions of these. And it's a royal pain. That's one of the reasons why I connected up with Numenta, who's making a business of this and has a very cool architecture, which they might come out with an open source version of it in the next year or so, probably less than a year. But I decided that I wanted to team up with Google because they have millions of processors and very good engineers, and they know how to do this probably better than anybody else in the world, at least on that scale. And so there are 3 engineers at Google that are working with me. And we're trying to implement a relatively simple version of this. And basically we're taking our MATLAB code and we're translating it into C++, which is generally a bad idea if you still don't have your theories well understood, because it's very hard to change. But as I said, we're implementing a very simple set of ideas. And those 4 key ideas, all of our engineering is based upon that. And what we want to do is build a system that we can then play with. That we can play with all of the more interesting ideas about attention and saliency and all the other cool stuff that we're interested in looking at, but can't now because the experiments take too long. And it's a sin, or it's not a sin, it's a shame, but most of us who build computational tools, we try at least once in our career to build one of these big complicated things. And it takes forever to run, and it takes forever to build and to change, and we give up. And then we go back and we wait for Intel to come along with a better workstation, and we work on our workstation. And every 5 years or so, we think, we're making progress. And then you find out that the department replaced the machine on your desk, and the processor was twice the speed, and there was twice as much memory, and that's probably a big factor in why you're making that progress. So we're going to try to leapfrog that. We're going to try to move 5 years ahead by catching the coattails of Intel and Google. And with that, I'd like to say thanks to a number of people, David Mumford especially, for turning me on to this and then encouraging me to move on this. My colleagues at Google, Glenn Carroll, Jim Lloyd, and Rich Washington. My good friends at Numenta, Dilip George and Bobby Jarvis, with whom I've had many great conversations and hope to continue working in the future. And a number of other people. And Kevin Murphy for a tool that he built while he was here at Berkeley. It's called the BaseNet Toolbox. It is a very nice tool. And the MATLAB software that's available online makes use of this. And that's it. Thank you. Yes?
So many of the methods that you described are used in automatic speech recognition.
Yeah.
Speech recognition engines at the basic levels in terms of recognizing sounds don't really work very well. You have between 30 and 50% of the so-called phonemes, the speech sounds, that are incorrectly recognized. The only way in which the speech recognition engines actually are able to get a really good estimate of the words is by training on priors and language models huge amounts of statistics in terms of the likely words, and you have links between the words and phoneme sequences. And so what in your methods allow you to essentially provide these language models, these top-down corrections for what is actually very faulty bottom-up processing?
Well, it's a wish and a prayer to some extent. But what happens when we use these algorithms for, say, looking at digits or something simple? The first couple of levels, you're learning little lines and edgelets. That looks good. We like that. At the next level, these are generative models, so you can sample them and get ideas of what they're looking at, as it were. Then you get little cursives and pieces of things. And they're distributed in such a way that the pieces are very easy to put back together. So we think that because of the way that we train these, in the case of just learning digits, we train it on digits that are it's as if a monkey was looking at a set of digits and then it's saccading and moving around. And so there are natural transformations corresponding to the saccade movements that give the slow feature learning its key.
So you're taking characters and you move them around by hand.
Yes.
Just translation only?
Yes. Well, translation and looming scaling. Right. And then we noise them up as well. And of course, people have been doing things like this for a long time. They perturb things in order to get more robustness on their algorithms. But when you start looking at what these do on natural scenes, they really start. And we do a lot of tricks that are sort of standard tricks in machine vision. So we do apply a Laplacians and things like that to get enhanced images. And we do a filter on the beginning of it, which is very similar to what, well, it's based upon what's known about the retina and the LGN in terms of contrast and illuminance and variance. So we're taking a couple of ideas from the field in this. But the slow feature analysis, when you train it on naturally occurring transformation, does seem to learn the right invariance, which provides the right pieces to put together at the levels above. What we found is that at every level, if the system is not almost deterministic, it's got a little noise in it, but almost deterministic in terms of its output, so very peaked distributions, then we have problems. And so we do a little couple of tricks with sort of applying the Laplacian to encourage that. But it's working, you know. And as I said, we won't know if it's really going to work until we, get it bigger. IBM didn't know that Markov decision, hidden Markov models in hierarchical fashion was going to really work until they were able to scale it up. So maybe we'll find it won't work. But I do think that the notion of inertial priors and the notion of slow features, I think it's a key. Maybe the only new key that we're sort of bringing to the table here. But it's, yeah.
Since a lot of your formalism depends on discrete representations or categories,
right.
Whereas a lot of sensory information is continuous and graded. I'm wondering how you see transitioning, like if you're going to do a gray level image and you take the output of a receptive field and you bin it into sort of category labels, it seems like that loses the graded flavor of
it does. I think that's a good thing, though. Yeah, I mean, they're distributed representations, so in fact, we show a single variable, but actually there's several variables, and so it's a sort of a joint distribution on a set of variables. So there's a lot of bits there to play with. And of course, the parameter spaces are, hundreds of thousands of parameters, so there's plenty of stuff to play around with. So it's not as though you don't have, real numbers, or not real numbers, whatever the resolution of your floating point numbers are. There you just have a certain number of bits to play with. We play with them in a different way. And my training is in discrete mathematics, point set topology and things like that, so I have to use the tools that I was trained in. We'll see. I'll see which works best.
You can always, I'm sorry, go ahead. You raise your hand.
I was going to ask about, so the highest levels in your network are the slowest, right? And they get sampled very infrequently.
Right.
Exponentially infrequently in
Yep.
terms of their level. And yet sometimes things in the world change suddenly, abruptly, and fundamentally.
Right.
If I don't know, if you're to get into a car, for instance, then the statistics of what you're experiencing are very different from when you're standing out by the street, and that's pretty much instantaneous. And something that troubles me a little bit about your representation of the world is it seems that some of the flow features, which are only sampled sparsely, wouldn't be able to synchronize when they said that things change, right? When they should.
Well, when we're using this for digits, for example, then what we do is we do supervised training at the top. So all the low-level features are learned in a completely unsupervised fashion. And then we clamp the top variables. So at that point, in some sense, there's a key, basically, that the system knows that there's a parameter that it's supposed to learn. And it only takes a few cycles of inference in order to fix that. So it's not one-shot learning, but it's very short number of shots in order to basically encode that.
But when you're running this network on a temporal sequence, though,
that's a good point.
You do force the top layers to be very slow, even if the world does change.
Right. That's a good point. Yep.
Well, but yeah, but I don't know if it's just germane to the way you did it. Perceptually, you could have slow ones at the time. If they're sampling real fast, they just react slowly most of the time. Then you could have something that, like some image appeared all of a sudden that was slow into the top, and you would highlight. But overall, the average is pretty slow.
One of the things that Dilip, George, and I have been talking about, and both of us want to perform the experiment, but we won't be able to do it until we have something that won't take weeks and months for it to run, is that in some sense that these sample back down. So they're keeping these memory traces. Essentially, they keep memory. All of the nodes keep memory. It's a short amount of memory. It's a very little stack, but they're keeping memory. And the things at the bottom they're very noisy. So it doesn't do any good to sample them because you're going to get the sort of same noise over and over again. But at the top, they get more and more deterministic. And so we're thinking that the way that we would train this is that the higher levels essentially will simulate the lower levels by basically sampling from them. And that in the spirit of what you just said, the rate of sampling as you go up will be exponentially faster, more samples in order to do the training. So they become sort of self-training as a consequence of that. We don't know if it's work. We've done it on the blackboard, and that's about it. But again, we sort of know how to do it, and we'll know what to run, what experiment to run once we have this up and running. Okay, thank you.